Thanks. And actually, we're going to have slides presented here. And here we go. Johnna's got them up. And if you go to presentation mode, let's crank it up. Excellent. So I'm going to start and just introduce our paper, which is about the idea of the spatial, the way in which the COVID period layers onto the Keynesian system in the Anglo-American countries of UK and US, and basically is affecting the spatial configuration of inequality in both of these places. Next slide, please. And we're building, as was Wood and his co-authors, on the idea of privatized Keynesianism introduced by Crouch. And one should note that that's very close to Streeck's ideas about the sort of capitalism. But whereas Streeck talks so much about wage levels, Crouch talks a lot about housing and debt, and the way that that has been fundamental to establishing aggregate demand in the countries. Our own work, and that of Mian and Sufi and others, has emphasized the importance of housing and debt over time, and the way in which the different crises, in particular the subprime crisis, has worsened the degree of wealth inequality in the United States in particular. So in terms of COVID, what we're looking at is first that, as you noted earlier, Judith, there is not a financial crisis. Those markets were bailed out, and they're still, in a sense, in remission. But instead, we don't see that. But what we do see are emergency welfare measures, temporary and taken from elsewhere, very piecemeal. And so we see a very kind of specific response that, while it's been described as exceptional, really is not. Next slide, please. And just to say that what we've got is the idea of, we're going to hit, Johnna, the next slide. We're just hitting some of the themes on, yeah, there you go, of the special issue, in particular, looking at the relationship between the national state and the localities, looking at the spatial, and really taking a kind of macro monetary view and linking this to the intersectional inequalities across the country, and asking the question about what about the power of the state and finance. Over to you.
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, we're really trying in this paper to again position the Anglo-American response to COVID within a kind of longer history, rather than looking just at what makes it exceptional. What also makes it kind of preserve privatized Keynesianism. At the moment, we over the summer we've gathered most of the research has been just focusing specifically on the UK. And again, it looks at all of the schemes, the ONS says there's 50 schemes, again, all kinds of different policy responses. And I think that's really important when we talk about privatized Keynesianism as an unacknowledged policy regime. What we mean is how all these fit together. So on the one hand, we have the kind of hyperbole of the Treasury claiming that, their response is unprecedented by the British state, which again is difficult to substantiate when we think about, for example, the post-war recovery. But also, crucially, is the continued use of unconventional monetary policy to almost immediately respond. Again, it's not so unconventional. It is a very conventional way now in Anglo-America to cope with shock. And the very familiar refrain that we're beginning to hear, the narrative introduced in around the budget and the false statement around golden rules and to expect austerity from the Treasury to pay for it, to pay for the bailouts. So that's the UK response. So if we think about the kind of bigger question here is really about comparing the unconventional monetary policy response on the one hand and contrasting that and comparing it with the fiscal response. So rather than assuming what policymakers tell us, which is that these are two completely different elements of statecraft, or public policy, pardon me, we look at them as coordinated elements of statecraft. Again, there are political choices being made and there is a policy agenda being put forward. So the most simplistic way is to look at the response as both the combination of unconventional monetary policy, which we see here is 895 billion, of which 875 goes to reserve tier one capital, the buying of government bonds that shores up banks' balance sheets via the central bank expanding its own, and then the 20 billion to directly buy assets from the corporate sector. Contrasting that to the 250 billion, which is seen as unprecedented in history as fiscal response, again divided up much more piecemeal across different sectors. So if we look at this just in the UK, we'll again try to mirror this in the analysis of the US, but to kind of break it down in more specific terms, it's really about kind of creating a framework by which to compare COVID Keynesianism as a response in Anglo-America. And in this case, we look at four distributional routes. Okay, so thinking about how does fiscal and monetary policy combine to create these outcomes, we look at four routes, drawing on the kind of literature within heterodox economics, economic geography, and international political economy that's sort of written on privatized Keynesianism in these forms. So the first distribution route is via assets, right? Asset markets, and how this translates into national wealth inequalities. The second distributional route is via income. And here, this is very broadly defined in terms of trying to capture the differentiation in national accounts between sources and composition of income, and rather focus on the kind of macro segmentation of labor markets when we think about what privatized Keynesianism is doing. As Gary talked about, Wolfgang Streeck is talking about wage inflation in very aggregate and general terms. Rather, we want to capture the way in which it is precisely labor market segmentation that allows, like many of the presentations have picked up on, this very differentiated effect of the income shock of the pandemic, but also allows, crucially, for the state to support through furlough, for example, those that are salaried workers and leave the self-employed and the gig economy workers adrift. The third distributional route is housing. And again, this draws really explicitly on housing within the privatized Keynesian model, but also the notions of housing-based welfare and the work in economic geography of talking about housing-based welfare as a way of understanding the connection between global markets and localities. Again, speaking to issues around urban and rural splits and geographical inequality, housing is really at the heart of the distributional route of how COVID, not only is inequality, we have housing inequality before COVID, but when we see in the UK response of tax cuts and monetary policy, the use of housing as a way to deliver welfare during the pandemic. And then finally, the distributional route of the welfare state broadly defined as both the provision of social security and income transfers, including health and social services. So here looking at, again, the austerity rhetoric, what happens after the bailouts, after assets, income, and housing are supported and the temporary measures are withdrawn, we see a slight reconfiguration in which the welfare state is again seen as part of the crisis response and its long tail, as it were.
1 minute left, thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, we're just rounding the corner here. So where do we get to then is really to talk about and unpack state transformation and the state and COVID, and what we can understand is really in Anglo-America about the preservation of the policy agenda, the unacknowledged or now the acknowledged and conventional privatized Keynesian policy agenda, in which the state is insisting, so this is the kind of double bind of COVID Keynesianism, right? The state is insisting on servicing all of its debts in a way to sustain the revenues, existing revenues of the financial services sector, but also wants to create new debt in vast amounts to provide liquidity, but also a future revenue for the financial services sector. The double bind then is that debt is both the cause of and the solution to the economic crisis we find ourselves in, again, although it's configured differently. And with each round of quantitative easing and austerity, it acts like a ratchet, creating a tightening around social provisioning of the state and reinforcing state allocation decisions that privilege monetary policy and wealthy asset holders. Crucially, those that are not asset holders, the middle and the lower income stratas, are the households that find themselves acutely in a triple bind. Again, talking about the transformation of the state for the middle class and lower income groups, in which they must be the shock absorbers of crisis, both the income shock that comes from loss of employment or cutting of hours, or perhaps even thinking about how that played out in terms of how work is done. But they must do so as well to maintain their current debt levels, which is really important, but also take on more debt, whether that's residential mortgages or small business loans. Whatever vision there is for how the banks are meant to transmit monetary policy to the household sector, they must do so as well as adapting to the withdrawal of state social security. And in the US and UK, of course, this element plays out differently around health and social
wrap up now,
provision.
Joanna, sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Wrap up.
So then the conclusion is really about thinking about the connection between these changes and how we might think about spatial inequality. So connecting these decisions made by policymakers to their spatial manifestation via asset-based inequality, income-based inequality, housing and welfare provision. So here, these are to kind of connect the big macro picture to kind of localized forms or spatial manifestations of the inequality that COVID makes visible. So yeah, this is our basic conclusion, that COVID is another iteration of crisis that allows us to see, like in 2008, the way in which the questions about inequality are being asked in terms of who is at risk of inequality. But when we take an economic geography perspective, we can better articulate where risk from inequality is located in regions, localities, and communities. And that's
Thanks
it.
very much, Gary and Joanna.